Hi, this is Eric from longboxreview.com, and this is The Gutters, special podcast edition. Did you know that Tuesday, September 30th is National Podcast Day? That's right. It's National Podcast Day, a way to celebrate and promote podcasting worldwide. This is put on by the website nationalpodcastday.com, where you can go for more information. Whether you're a podcaster yourself, a potential podcaster, or a listener of podcasts, where you can find out what exactly a podcast is and what you can do to enjoy podcasts more, I guess. And the way that I've decided to participate in this event, and quite frankly, I'm not sure why I wanted to, other than I like the idea of promoting podcasts. This is exactly what I do as a fun thing in my life. While my topic is usually about comic books, I've expanded it a little bit recently with these Gutters episodes, and I've just been thinking that there should be something beyond that which I've been doing for the last few years in the podcast arena, and I guess I just wanted to participate as a means to explore that idea a little bit more. So if you're curious, go to, as I said, nationalpodcastday.com, where you can find out more information about this. There are a few events that are being put on in the next day or two to promote National Podcast Day. One is on September 29th, Monday at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. It's a Google Plus Hangout with Mike Russell, where he'll be hosting a webinar on real audio production techniques. You can ask Mike anything about audio producing, editing, improving sound, along with workflows in Adobe Audition or your favorite digital audio workflow program. I happen to use Audacity because it's free. It's served me very well. I'm really interested in this webinar, and I hope to be able to catch it after it's done. I cannot listen to it at lunchtime on Monday, however. But maybe you can. And you can find more information on the National Podcast Day website. On National Podcast Day, on September 30th, you have the official live stream that starts at 9 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, where you can Skype or call in. And there's a link on the website for that. The Podcasters Roundtable, hosted by Ray Ortega, is doing an event, a roundtable discussion about National Podcast Day at 4:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then finally, of note, there is a how-to podcast for free on iTunes. It's a live podcast day stream that is at 6 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. This is put on by Paul Colligan. Want to know how to podcast, or better yet, how to podcast for free? Paul Colligan is going to teach you how on his YouTube channel. And there you go. So that's National Podcast Day. I thought that I would go ahead and take this opportunity then to talk about a bunch of podcasts that I happen to listen to and promote them on this National Podcast Day. Let's see here. I last did this, looks like a couple years ago, episode 32, where I talked about 13 podcasts. Okay, so as a podcaster, I think it's important that you get involved or immerse yourself in the medium itself. And so I'm a podcaster, so therefore I should listen to other podcasts. It's kind of like if you're a writer, you should read books. If you're an artist, you should look at other people's art, things along those lines. So I have a bunch of podcasts, and I'm just going to run through them real quick, just say a few words about them. And I'll have links in the show notes for all of these that I talk about. Let's see. Up top here, since we are talking about National Podcast Day, there's a few podcast-related podcasts, a few related shows. I got to come up with something other than saying podcast 5 million times here. There's a few of these, the Audacity to Podcast, where Daniel J. Lewis talks about various things having to do with podcasting. He used to do, it used to be focused almost exclusively on Audacity, the program. And then he went to every 5 episodes, it would be about Audacity. And that's what drew me to the podcast to begin with, was I just wanted to learn more about how to use Audacity better in my podcast workflow. But since then, he's moved on to other things, more generally podcast related. There's been a lot of interesting topics and the subject matter that he's brought up. I mentioned Ray Ortega before, and he does the Podcasters Studio podcast, where basically he does the same kind of thing that Daniel does in the Audacity podcast, but he talks about podcasting and equipment and just other topics related to podcasting. And I really like listening to Ray. He also hosts a what's called the Podcasters Roundtable, where he and a bunch of other people, including Daniel Lewis, get online on Google Plus, and they have a topic that they all discuss, and he invites other people to participate, which I think is really cool. I'd like to be on that someday. Let's see here. I listen to a bunch of pop culture or news / commentary / politics podcasts, and a bunch of comics podcasts. So let's talk about the news / commentary / politics. Those are just kind of the category I've thrown these into. Let's see. First up is the Sainio Cast. Ryan Sainio. This is kind of like an audio blog, if you will. He brings up a lot of different things, not the least of which are things going on in his life, just observations that he has about various topics. So it's kind of a free-for-all as far as topic goes, but I really like it because there's a lot of just kind of off the cuff sometimes, and disparate topics that go on in his podcast. I talked about this one last time on that episode 32, where you have Peter Rios from Comic Geek Speak, the Daily Rios podcast. Now, he hasn't released an episode in a long time because this started out I think more of a challenge, more as a challenge, an experiment to see if he could do a Monday through Friday daily podcast for a year, which he did. And ever since that year has ended, his release on the podcast side of the Daily Rios, because he also does he has a website where he releases things. So he does things daily. It's just that the podcast is just now a part of that. Then there's Star Talk, that is with Neil deGrasse Tyson. It's astronomy. That's one of my interests. When I was a little boy, I wanted to be an astronomer and or an astronaut. So topics about space and space travel, exploration, all that stuff, that's always been something of an interest of mine. Related to that sort of is Science Friday, the Science Friday podcast. This is by Ira Plato. I think that's actually a radio show that they then turn into, the segments that they do, they turn into individual podcasts. So every Friday, there's at least, I want to say 3 or 4, if not more, episode releases having to do with various scientific topics. And so I'll listen to some of those. Related to media, there's a podcast called On the Media, where the focus is on news topics of the day. They'll take a look at how the media is responding to that topic as opposed to actually focusing on the topic itself. And I find that very interesting. There's a couple new ones I've added to my feed recently. Alex Bloomberg, who was involved with the Planet Money podcast as well as This American Life, which I'll talk about in just a minute, decided to leave his job with This American Life, and I presume the other podcast as well, to start his own business. And he's releasing a new podcast called Startup, which is all about that process. So it's really interesting to listen to how Mr. Bloomberg starts off with the idea of this adventure or this venture and is pursuing it as time goes on. So if you were ever curious about how a business gets going and gets up and running, and all of the problems and the worry that goes along with it, this is a podcast to listen to. The next one is called Serial. So this is also by a This American Life alum. Sarah Koenig is doing this spin-off podcast where they're examining one story for an entire season of this show. So while on This American Life, you'll get a bunch of different topics or a bunch of different audio productions around a particular theme, Serial is going to take basically one story and follow it through from beginning to end over the course of however many episodes it's going to be. And then the next season, if you will be a different, I presume, story. So the one that's coming up, it has to do with a murder case and whether the guy is guilty or innocent. And so I'm really looking forward to that because it's in the vein of This American Life, but as I said, it is focused on one case, one story. And of course, I can't stop talking about This American Life, and so I have to do that here, which I have to say This American Life is one of my very favorite podcasts. I want to say my number one favorite podcast, but overall, it probably is that. But Ira Glass and company doing these fantastic stories, as I said, various stories built around whatever theme they've come up with for that week. If you are a fan of storytelling and just listening to engaging material, this is the podcast for you. And there's such a variety of it too. You know, I can only listen to so many comic book podcasts, even though that's the thing I love the most. Oh, that would be so cool if This American Life did a comic book themed episode. Anyway, so those are the news, commentary, politics. Let's talk about some pop culture stuff. If you're really into movies, and specifically movie or people that are working in the industry, here's a good podcast for you. It's called Friends in Your Head. It used to be called Down in Front, but apparently that name was being used by another entity, and they were asked to stop using it. So they did. Now they're called Friends in Your Head, and it's just a bunch of mostly young guys with one old guy in there who's been in the business for a long time. But they get together and they talk about specific movies, or they come back and they talk about various topics relating to production involving movies. And sometimes they just tell stories about their involvement in various movies. So it's a really interesting show. Moving on to TV, there are a couple podcasts that I listen to relating to TV. One is a very specific television-focused podcast called the Magnum Cast, and you could probably guess what it's about. It's about the show, the great American television show, Magnum P.I., one of my very favorite TV shows of all time. It's a relatively new podcast where they have started examining the show episode by episode. Sometimes they cover 2 episodes, maybe 3 in one show. But they have, 8 seasons of Magnum to go through, so they have plenty of time to examine that show. Next up is the Pizza Party Podcast. This is put on by the guys who do the Fight for Comics podcast. Now they used to talk on the Fight for Comics show about Arrow and some other shows that they were watching, and they got to do that so much that they decided to spin it off into its own show so that the Fight for Comics show could focus exclusively on comics, and the Pizza Party Podcast could focus on television programs. And I find the guys just very entertaining. So I listen to both podcasts, even though I don't watch most of the shows that they talk about. It's that interesting to me. More general pop culture related is the Nerdist Podcast. This is Chris Hardwick's show. I don't always care for Chris when he's talking, but what I do enjoy are the guests that he is able to get on the show and the conversation that they have. It doesn't always have to do with whatever the project the guest is currently doing. They just kind of get together and shoot the breeze, really, and go, to various topics along the way. And I find that that conversation interesting. And sometimes it's just downright funny. And then finally in this category, we have a podcast called Nerd Goggles here. This is done by the wonderful MJ, and she does a podcast basically where she talks about the books that she reads, but also other things as well. Sometimes she'll talk about comics. Sometimes she'll talk about shows she's watched. It's just a really interesting look at the interests of this person, and I like listening to her. And finally, my favorite podcast in this category, the Pop Culture Happy Hour, which is an NPR show co-hosted by Linda Holmes, Stephen Thompson, Glenn Weldon, and other guests as well, where they talk, as pretty much the title says, everything having to do with pop culture. I particularly like Glenn Weldon on here because he's the guy that writes about books and comic books for the NPR website, as he says every week. And I really enjoy the camaraderie between the three main hosts and the guests they bring on, the guest hosts they bring on. And what I really love about this is the way that they end the show every week, which is what is making them happy that week. It's actually something that I've been considering stealing for my own show, just because I just love that idea of celebrating something that makes you happy instead of harping on the things that irritate you or just makes you mad. You know, there's too much negativity in pop culture as it is. So, you know, why not celebrate those things that make you happy? And it makes me happy listening to these people talking about what makes them happy. And many of the same things that make them happy make me happy. And finally, the comics list. You know, I am a comic book podcaster myself, and so I like listening to other comic book related podcasts. And there's a bunch of them. Although, you know, I try a bunch of different shows, and some of them I stick with, and some of them I listen just a little bit and decide, you know, they're not for me, or I like particular shows and I just don't have time to listen to a bunch of other ones too. So I'll give a new podcast a shot, but you know, if it's not capturing my attention for very long, then I drop it. But these are the ones that I'm currently listening to. First up is Fat Man on Batman. This is the show that Kevin Smith does where he focuses on Batman. Really what I like about this show is when he brings on people involved with the movies, actors or others, and the comic book creators that he brings on to talk about comic book or the Batman comics over the years. He's had Neil Adams on there a couple times, and man, those two together, just Neil Adams telling stories and Kevin Smith, you know, egging him on to tell more stories. Although I'd say Neil Adams does not need a whole lot of prodding to get the stories out. But anyway, I don't listen to every episode, but I do enjoy the show when he's got some interesting guests on there. Still focused on a particular comic book franchise, there's the Legion of Substitute Podcasters show. This is done by Paul French and some other guys, where they talk about the Legion of Superheroes, and they'll focus on a particular issue of the Legion of Superheroes. Lately, I've been tuning in because of the appearance of the Legion in the Justice League United series. So I kind of wanted to see what they had to say about that. Plus, they've had some interviews with some Legion creators recently that I found interesting. The Heroes and Villains podcast, put on by Bruce Leslie. It's a show that I've been on a couple times, and I've had Bruce on an episode of my show as well, where Bruce did an interesting thing. He takes a look at a particular hero or villain, usually a hero, with a guest, which is just a wonderful idea. Get some involvement and people to participate as well, and talk about in depth a particular character from comic books. So I thought that was pretty neat. There's the Geek History Lesson. This is a relatively new show in my listening feed. This is by Jason Inman and Ashley Robinson. Jason Inman also does a video log, comic book related video show, the name of which I can't remember. I don't think it's Geek History Lesson. I think it's something else. But I found him very entertaining. That's where I discovered him was on YouTube, and then I found out he was doing this podcast. So they'll focus on a particular character. It doesn't have to be comic book related. Like it's a geek history lesson, not a comic book history lesson. But comic book stuff does creep in there. Lately, they've been doing a bunch of Doctor Who focused shows, which are interesting. There's the Nerdist Comics panel, which is part of the Nerdist Writers panel. So that the Nerdist Writers panel podcast, I believe, they'll throw in these comics panel shows every once in a while. This is done by a few guys, not the least of which is Len Wein, comic book legend Len Wein. So they'll get together and bring a guest on usually and talk specific things. When you have Len Wein on there, involved in both major companies for so long and has such a history, the stories are interesting, and the commentary as well. There are two interview shows that I listen to. One, of course, is John Suntress's Word Balloon. So again, this is one of those shows where I don't listen every episode or listen to every episode, but depending on the guest and or the topic involved, I'll download the episode and listen to it. And then there's the Let's Talk Comics. This is done by Jim Biscardi, who used to work at Marvel in the PR department. And so he's taken those connections and brings on a particular creator, and they talk about their career usually, and how they broke in, how do they work their craft. He's had on some color artists recently, and that's something that I find very interesting. That's a part of the craft that doesn't get a lot of attention, I don't think, and I find it interesting to hear how these artists create color for comic books. He's had on Brian Michael Bendis. Oh man, the list goes on, but he's doing an interesting show that way. And then finally, two more shows that I'll talk about. One is Fight for Comics. I mentioned that earlier. That's actually one of my very favorite shows to listen to because Sean, Jonas, and Brighton are just damn funny. They make, every time I listen to the show, either Fight for Comics or the Pizza Party podcast, I just laugh. It never fails to entertain me, and I almost always laugh at least once about something they say. And it's just, just four friends getting together and just riffing off each other and just throwing out things and talking about the things they love, whether it's comics or a TV show that they're watching or a movie or whatever. It reminds me a lot of me and my friends when we were younger, hanging around the comic book shop or at each other's houses, reading each other's comics and just talking about stuff. It's just a lot of fun. And of course, and not the least of which I want to talk about is Comic Geek Speak, CGS, because that is the show that I first listened to. That was my first podcast that I listened to. When I found out what podcasts were back in 2006, I found Comic Geek Speak, and I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. Because again, kind of like Fight for Comics, these are friends who got together and decided to talk about comic books and everything related to that. The show has changed a lot over the last, decade. I think they're coming up on their 10-year anniversary. And yeah, that's right, because they started in 2005, I believe, and so next year will be 10 years. They had recently had one of their own pass on after a battle with cancer, and various people have left the show and they sometimes come back, but I think that Murd and Shane and Professor Everly have been doing a bang-up job keeping the fires going, as it were. And I really enjoy it when other people come back. Pants has recently come back to the show, although that may change. Peter Rio sometimes comes back for an appearance. I really wish Brian, the originator of Comic Geek Speak, has come on for a couple shows here in the last several months. I wish more of the old geeks would do that as well. Regardless, it's a great show. They talk about all different sorts of things relating to comics, and they've been around since the beginning, essentially, of comic book podcasting. And they built a network of people, friends, contacts, and they bring on various people on the show. It's been a lot of fun listening to them over the years. And as I said, I've said this before, listening to Comic Geek Speak helped inspire me to do my own podcast. It's what I aspire to do with my own show. And so I have a lot of respect and admiration for the guys for what they do. So there you go. That's all the podcasts I currently listen to. Like I said, that list is constantly changing. When I hear about a new show that sounds interesting, or somebody whom I listen to and respect recommends a show, then I will go check it out. That's how I've discovered the SanuCast and Nerd Goggles. I think that's about it. That's currently on my list. So hopefully my listing these shows will convince you to try out some of these shows and be entertained and informed as I have been. So what are you doing for National Podcast Day, podcasters? Or if you are not yet a podcaster, how about you give it a try? I'm actually going to do a future show about my specific experiences getting my podcast up and running, and I'm going to go into some detail about the production side of it, the cost involved, who I use for podcast hosting and why, and all that kind of stuff. I was asked about this on Twitter. Someone who follows me asked me about, how to podcast, that kind of a thing. So I've been thinking about this for a long time. And so I decided that I should, with this National Podcast Day, perhaps use that as a springboard to go ahead and do that. So look for that in a future Gutters episode. And as far as you podcast listeners, if you are still content just being a podcast listener, that is great. That is awesome. Obviously, not everybody can be a podcaster. We need listeners too. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen to my show. It's wonderful to know that there are people out there who actively go and download an episode and listen to it. And of course, to those who leave feedback, rate and reviews on iTunes, that is awesome. Or just, hitting me up on Twitter or sending me an email, however it is that you contact me, that just makes my day, guys and gals. It really does. It inspires me to keep doing what I'm doing, and I really appreciate your feedback. If you'd like to leave feedback, perfect segue, right? If you'd like to leave feedback about this, about National Podcast Day or any of the podcasts that I talked about, you can do so by sending email to longboxreview@gmail.com, or you can leave comments at the website longboxreview.com. Thanks for listening, everybody.